Mamta Chaudhry has studied with Marilyn Robinson and has also taught literature and creative writing at the University of Miami. Her early fiction, poetry, and feature articles have been published in newspapers and magazines in the States and in India. She is currently working on a second novel. She lives with her husband in Coral Gables, Florida, and they spend part of each year in India and in France. Margot Livesey is the author of a collection of stories and 8 novels, including Eva Moves the Furniture, The Flight of Gemma Hardy, Mercury, and the collection The Hidden Machinery, Essays on Writing. She is the recipient of awards from the NEA, the Guggenheim Foundation, and the Radcliffe Institute. She lives in Cambridge and is on the faculty of the Iowa Writers' Workshop. Tonight, they'll be discussing Mamta's novel, Haunting Paris, the story of Sylvie, who discovers a letter among her late lover Julian's effects that propels her on a search into the secrets of his past and the dark history of Nazi-occupied Paris. On her quest for knowledge, she is joined by a silent observer, Julian's ghost. Marilyn Robinson calls it a small parable pondering the nature of civilization itself, and Booklist says Haunting Paris is a graceful debut, revealing a finely textured world where grief and love commingle, a powerful testament to the enduring strength of the bonds we form in life. And now I'm honored to turn things over to our speakers. The digital podium is yours, Mamta and Margot.
Thank you, Lauren. You know, one of the things is before any sort of event, I always worry about freezing up, and now I have to worry about the video freezing up too. But we shall put those worries aside until and hopefully not have any technical problems. But thank you, Lauren, so much, and to Harvard Bookstore for hosting us, to Margot Livesey, who's taken time out so graciously from her own pre-publication frenzy for her new novel, which comes out in August. It's The Boy in the Field. And the first thing I'm going to do, as soon as this event is over, is to pre-order a copy of that book from Harvard Bookstore. So I hope you'll join me in doing that. You know, one thing about bookstores is that they keep us connected, all of us, those of you who've joined in this evening, readers and writers, virtually connected anyway. And we all know that you can buy books elsewhere and maybe save a couple of dollars. But when you buy from your local independent bookstore, you gain a whole community. And it's something that speaks very strongly to me. Wherever I am in the world, the first place I make a beeline for is the local bookstore. And all of a sudden, a place that is unfamiliar feels very familiar. The first time I saw Paris, it also felt eerily familiar. And I couldn't understand why, because it's so different from the tropical Indian city where I grew up, and from the subtropical American one that I now call home. But I think Paris is one of those cities that exercises such a hold on one's imagination, whether we've been there or not. We know Paris, and our knowledge is formed by books or by films. So when we go there, we feel it's instantly home in a way. Many years later, many years later, when I wrote my own book about Paris, it's no surprise that it was a love letter to the City of Light. But unlike, say, Woody Allen's Midnight in Paris, which is a charming, funny Valentine to the city, mine is a love letter that is more layered, more complicated, and more heart-wrenching in the way that love can often be. Paris is one of those cities that's really easy to love, but really hard to know. And even before I went there, friends, both American and French, told me to cross the threshold, c'est difficile. And for me, it seemed more than difficile, it seemed impossible. I am so clearly an étrangère, a stranger, a foreigner, an outsider. And I have to tell you, I didn't set out to write about Paris, and certainly not from this perspective. I'm not French, not Jewish, neither man nor ghost. But that was a voice I heard, and I felt compelled to follow it wherever it took me. As many writers will tell you, sometimes we don't choose our stories, sometimes they choose us. And so it was with this story. One day I was walking down a street on Ile Saint-Louis, and I heard a drift of music coming down from a lighted window, and I couldn't see who was playing, but I had this really strong image of a man leaning forward and listening very intently. And I became fixated by that image. I really wanted to know who that was. And as you'll see, it was Julien, drawn back to the woman he loved and to the place he called home while he lived. It was the music that had summoned him back to a world where he had unfinished business. So the novel is set in 1989, when all Paris is getting ready to celebrate the bicentennial of the French Revolution, which gave us the glorious motto, Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité. And even today, anywhere you walk, you'll see those three words chiseled into every public building, every monument. You can't escape them. Sylvie is up in her apartment on Ile Saint-Louis, and she's mourning the loss of Julien, who died some months previously. Quite by accident, as Lauren mentioned, she discovers a letter and sets out on a quest for the unfinished business that Julien had left behind. She did know that Julien's sister and her two daughters were rounded up in 1942. What she didn't know was that Julien believed that one of the daughters might have survived. So armed with this letter and a very scant clue, she sets out to discover what might have happened. And in doing so, in going back to Julien's past and to the year 1942, when the roundups of Jews were taking place in Paris, and France singularly failed to live up to its own motto of Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité. So this is a love story in which one of the lovers is dead, a mystery in which the detective is a pianist so shy that her nickname is Sylvie La Timide, a historical novel that has really urgent resonances for today, and a ghost story in which the ghost is the least terrifying thing of all. And you know, one of the things that I keep getting asked is, do you believe in ghosts? No, of course not. And yet, when you are in Paris, you are always in their company. You walk the cobblestone streets and you feel them thronging beside you, and they're particularly thick on Ile Saint-Louis. And I always want to ask them, what draws you back? But when I turn my head to look, they retreat into the shadows and into silence. So I just want to say that many scenes in the novel take place in and around Notre Dame, but right behind the cathedral, whose towers soar up to the sky, is a memorial, a museum that sinks into the earth. And it was at the Memorial de la Déportation that I became aware of the darker shadows underpinning the city of light. And that's when the story took a different turn. You know, at the deportation memorial, there's a bronze circle on the ground, and it's chiseled with the words, "They went to the end of the earth and they did not return." And then my hair stood straight up as I remember the French word for ghost, revenant, one who returns. So that became the first line in my book. And I also had the answer to the question, what draws you back? So I'll just read the first page, which gives you a sense of this voice that I heard and where it led me into totally unexpected places. Okay, let me take a sip of water. If it were wine, the reading would be better, but hey, this is what I have. They call us revenants, those who return. Restless for this world, we pass each other in mute recognition, for to be silent and solitary is our essential condition. But death doesn't end our thirst for a human touch, a human voice calling our name. And so I haunt these familiar quays, this familiar river. Music drifts down from Sylvie's window, and I linger until it comes to an end. The scent of lilacs on the breeze stirs dormant phantoms to life, but music is sorcery more potent. Though bound to time's measure, it exists on a plane beyond time. Where there is no past and no future, there is only the present in which the dead revisit this world. Night after night, I wait until the last notes fade away and Sylvie comes to the window at last. I retreat into the shadows as one after another, the beautiful mansions along Quai d'Anjou spring to light, transforming those in the gloom below into a throng of ghosts. Occasionally, a passing figure pauses in a pool of lamplight to light a cigarette or glance at a watch. Squandered time, the most enduring of regrets. In the end, a lifetime is not enough. The heart yearns for more. Who can reason with desire? The heart has its reasons that reason cannot know. So, obsessions are like desire, you know, there's no reasoning with them. And if anyone knows about obsessions, it's Margot Livesey, who wrote this brilliant book called Mercury, which deals with an obsession. And if you've read it, you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't, you're in for a treat. So, Margot, let's talk obsessions.
Let's talk obsessions. That was wonderful, Mamta. It was just such a pleasure to hear a little bit about how you came to write the novel and also to give some sense of its scope and breadth. One of the things that I was struck by rereading it was how many lovely, vivid details there you use to create the City of Light. And also the way in which you offer us moments of accidental or maybe incidental wisdom. So, for instance, I now know that the croissant, the archetypal French baked good, is not strictly speaking a French invention. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you did your research for the novel once you had been seduced into writing it.
Well, the seduction is certainly a big part of being drawn into any book, because you have to live with it for a long time. And in my case, longer than most. I had jet black hair, I want you to know, when I started writing. So it took a while. And perhaps it's because I'm not a very efficient writer. You know, I don't think, oh, this is what I'm going to write about. Here's the story. Let me go there and research it. And research is, as any writer will tell you, it's like a labyrinth in which you happily get lost because it allows you to procrastinate as far as the writing goes. You know, you think, well, it's almost like writing. But when you're inside the labyrinth, you just find this slender thread of a story, and then you have to follow it out, hope it'll get you out. So in my case, the research was very, as I said, inefficient, but you know, it's no hardship to have to keep going back to Paris as you think of new things that you want to look up. And there were so many things that I discovered along the way. As you said about the croissant, which is not actually French, and you'll find out when you read the book where it comes from. But also, I think part of it is that after you have done all the research, at some point you have to just put it aside. Because when you read history books, you learn what happened. But when you read fiction, you feel that you lived what happened. So that's a difference. And, you know, I think one of the things that Hilary Mantel does so well, and not just in her Tudor trilogy, but also in a wonderful book she wrote, 1,100 pages or something, about the French Revolution. It's called A Place of Greater Safety. You know, this is over 200 years ago, and you're still catching your breath at some of the things that are going on. So I wanted to do the research and then make it seem entirely as if it were happening, and it wasn't, that filter had been removed.
And I think you do that in a completely wonderful way. One of the things that's, let me reverse out of that. I was going to say the great William Trevor, the great late William Trevor, a wonderful story writer and novelist, once said that he thought of himself as an experimental writer, but all the experiments were hidden. And I thought of that as such a beautiful description. And I feel a little bit like that about Haunting Paris, that it might seem like a conventional novel, but as you get into it, you think, no, this is an extremely radical, perhaps even revolutionary novel in the best way. And I wondered if you had any literary ancestors or influences who were haunting you while you were haunting Paris.
You know, when you said that about it's all hidden, I'm thinking about your book, The Hidden Machinery, which is exactly what writers do. You know, all this work that goes into it, all this craft that goes into it, and then you want to remove it and make it seem really as if it flowed out without as if you were taking dictation. For me, I had a lot of literary ancestors, a lot of influences, but I think what was actually the most direct influence on me was the act of reading. You know, I grew up in a city that is a book lover's paradise. In Calcutta, there are bookshops and libraries, and even the famous College Street book stalls, somewhat like the bouquiniste along the Seine. So I read voraciously. And Margot, probably like you, I started out with Enid Blyton and, you know, the famous Five and the Williams books, right?
Yeah.
Is that something, the very English British tradition that formed part of my education? And also, when I went to college in Calcutta, it was to Loreto College, where I had wonderful teachers. And one of the great pleasures of being a late blooming debutante is being able to acknowledge that debt to everyone from whom I have learned so much. Shakespeare has always been an influence in my life, and you can probably tell that very glancingly from the book, where one of the characters is a Shakespeare professor. And sometimes books come into your life just at the very moment when you need them to. And two books that I can think of came to me in that way. One was Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, and the other was Housekeeping by Marilyn Robinson. So I'm not sure that they're direct influences, but they are very formative of me as a writer.
And both novels in which the past, the dead, exerts a powerful lure. So I can completely understand that. Going back to the Shakespeare professor you just mentioned, he's American, and one of your subplots is the American in Paris. In this case, a heterosexual couple who are coming for a few months, and who occupies Sylvie's newly created apartment. She's subdivided her apartment after the death of her husband. And many writers have explored the American or British person in Paris. I mean, I think of Ozick and Baldwin and James and Bowen, and maybe did Forster have any books set in France? Maybe not, but it's the same idea, only in Italy. And did you have that tradition at all in mind? I mean, I love how your Americans function in the novel and how thrilled they are with Paris.
You know, they actually did have a very specific function, two specific functions. One was that they're a stand-in for the reader. You know, if it were just French people in a French setting, there would be things they would know. And so if I explained it, they would be, who are you talking to? But if I explain false cognates or some bit of history that somebody who lives in Paris would know, then the Americans function as a stand-in for the reader, because as they learn it, so does the reader. The other function was, you know, how the American in Paris story is always about the development of the American protagonist, the sort of transformation by going to the city. And Paris and Parisians are a backdrop to that transformation. So I sort of wanted to switch it a little bit and make the Americans the backdrop to the life that went on before they went there and will continue after they leave. And, you know, I found this myself. My husband is American, and when we go, that we don't fit into any hierarchical structure. So it's a lot easier for people, you know, to let their hair down with us, because we are birds of passage, we'll be gone. And that indeed is the case with Sylvie, that she can confide in a way in the Americans that she can't to anyone else, because it has nothing to do with them. The story, they're not directly implicated in it.
And of course, Sylvie's dog, the wonderful Coco, forms a link between the two households, the adjacent apartments. And one of the many miracles of your novel is how many different points of view you have. You have the point of view of a ghost, you have Coco's point of view, you have the points of view of many characters. And it was a delight for me to read, but periodically I would look up and think, oh, this must have been so hard to write, by which I really mean, of course, that if I tried it, I would find it very hard. So was having so many points of view your first choice, or something that you made your way to?
You know, I think everything was I made my way to. It's nothing that I started off with any sort of clear-cut idea. I told you I heard the voice of the ghost, and that was very clear. That was the I in the book, the first person. But you know, the book deals so much with memory, and memory is like the Seine. It is so fluid. There is no place of demarcation between past and present. They flow together. And so in that way, I did want to have it, this sort of flowing consciousness. But you know, the problem with that is you also have to keep it intelligible. You can't just flow from one to the other without people knowing. And my editor, Nantalise, came up with just this simple, brilliant thing that helped clarify it. She said, well, just put the ghost part in italics.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, it's one of those things that in retrospect you think, of course, but it takes somebody outside yourself to see that. Also, the other thing, and you brought this up, it's your fault, because questions about craft are, you know, like catnip to writers. We could just go on about them. I was experimenting with the whole idea of omniscience. You know, what can you know? So much, even of people we know well, people we love, so much remains opaque. Places we know well still guard some of their mystery. So any sort of omniscience is already fragmentary. And even the ghost who has access to deeper time, you know, he can see underlying patterns in history, the times that he returns to, that the living in the present cannot. Even his knowledge is circumscribed. He says, my terrain is not the future, but the past. So that's for point of view.
I think I'm relieved to hear that. And of course, thinking of Virginia Woolf, again, I think about how her point of view moves so flexibly in her novels. This is the next thing I want to say isn't actually really a question. It's more of a statement, but we can pretend it's a question, which is that one time I heard the mystery writer, Walter Mosley, say that every novel ought to have a mystery. And I thought that was such a wise thing to say. And one of the pleasures of haunting Paris is that how tightly plotted it is and how suspenseful it is. I found myself reading the second half of the novel in a single sitting because I couldn't bear not to know what happened to your characters. And so I just was really blown away by how plot functions in this novel in such a deep way to reveal the characters, which of course is what it always should be doing, but sometimes the plot tyrannizes the characters rather than reveals them.
Well, thank you for saying that, because plotting is not one of my strengths. You know, that whole thing about plot is character in action. I'm interested in the character and how the character reveals himself or herself in the actions they take. And so that develops the plot. They sort of, I put them on the page and they reveal themselves to me in what they're doing. And then of course, for me, this is the really pleasurable part of writing, after, you know, blundering through trying to figure out where is the story going. Once you know that, to come back and shape it so that you know that the arc of the story is now clear to you, and you can go back to the beginning and make it equally clear to the reader. But I have to tell you, starting out, it's like, you know, blind man's buff. You're going, okay, well, what is she going to do next? And, you know, you're surprised along the way, which is which is kind of a nice thing.
Or maybe it's like finding your way around the Latin Quarter for the first time.
Yes, that's true.
But speaking of what you say about characters in action, and it comes up over and over again in my workshops, how we judge characters by their action. I mean, and I think one of the scenes which really propels the novel forward in such a brilliant way is that first dinner party, when we see your heroine Sylvie the timid, become Sylvie the lion-hearted. It's the dinner party at which Julienne falls in love with her. Sylvie is his children's piano teacher, the 13th guest. And there's just this wonderful moment when she turns on this pompous young playwright. And those three words, I think, completely bring us into the novel and take us to Sylvie's side. And I'm only talking about it this freely because it takes place on page 27. So I feel that can't quite count as a spoiler.
No, it doesn't. And I hope the rest of you out there are thinking of your questions. Just don't give away the ending, okay? Otherwise, Margot as the teacher will put you in the corner, all right? So, but think of questions, because, we're having a conversation here about how books get made, and it isn't as well. Maybe for some people it is. I know for some people it is, and they sit and write from A to Z and then get $1 million advances. And I think my husband sometimes wishes I were that kind of writer, instead of driving him mad with what my neuroses about having to get to the story. But Margot, I'm so glad you mentioned the dinner scene. So here I'll tell you a very direct influence. This is how Virginia Woolf blighted my life, okay? I was all set to, teach, and I got my PhD, and was thinking of an academic career. And then I reread To the Lighthouse, and I read the dinner scene, the dinner party. And there was this, if you've read it, you know this already, where around this dining table with the candles lit and all these people glowing around it, it seems like an island of just wonderful things, of great security, while anything outside the windows is dark and troubled and rough waters. So I wanted to write a dinner scene. And this is what I meant to say, that I quit all lucrative employment in order to follow this quixotic dinner scene of my own. But I also wanted to see what it would be like not to be one of the people inside in this glowing, safe haven, but to be one of the ones outside looking in longingly through this lighted window to a world that they couldn't belong to. And that is very much the case with Sylvie, that she is an outsider in this very aristocratic world. She's poor, her mother is a maid. So it was in a way writing both as homage and as reversal of that dinner scene.
I'm going to ask one more writerly question before we turn to the audience's question. In writing the novel, did you have a writer's group or mentors or support? I suppose I'm really asking, what kept you going, and who did you go to when you needed someone to hold up a mirror to what you've accomplished?
That's so important, because I cannot tell you the number of times I went, what do I need to drive myself mad for? I don't need to do this. The world is not clamoring for a novel about this time and about this place. And, this is my private obsession. And so I have been on the verge of despair many a time. And I didn't go to an MFA program where you get a ready-made, circle of readers, of other writers with whom you stay connected through your publishing life. And also, I'm in Miami, which is quite far from New York. So I imagined all these people having all these lunches and dinners with publishers. And I felt quite sorry for myself. But in a way, I think being away was a huge help. What kept me going was sheer bloody mindedness and stubbornness. Of course, now I like to say, still she persisted. But then it was just like this, it's like a terrier with something between its teeth, I just couldn't drop it. So I kept going. And I've stayed in touch with a couple of writers with whom I undertook some workshops and master classes. And my first reader, who is fortunately right at hand, is my husband. And nobody was happier than Daniel when the book finally got published, because he'd never have to read another damn draft again. So that sort of kept me going, that I could, just bully him into reading every single version, and there were many on the way.
I just suspect that this does not capture his feelings, but I'm going to move to one. David asks, is there anything that you learned from the process of writing this novel that stands out to you?
Yes, I did. One of the things when I started writing this, there was a great deal of trepidation. Although this is my first novel to be published, it's not the first novel I wrote. And I wrote about Calcutta, I wrote about Miami, and, came very close, but they were rejected. And so I said, the heck with this, I'm going to write something light and bright and sparkling. Well, of course, within the first page, you can see that it goes to a much darker place. And I guess that's my bent. So the trepidation, David, was I'm writing about a city that is not my city, about a history that's not my history. And I felt this real need to get everything right. I just live in fear that somebody's going to tap me on the shoulder and say, but madame, this is not in this arrondissement, it's in the next arrondissement. So I was very, very obsessive about getting the details. And what I discovered was that if it was important to me to get these right, how much more of a moral responsibility I had when I was writing about the Holocaust. So one of the things that has been the most gratifying is the number of letters I've gotten from people who are actually either themselves survivors or the children of survivors who have said that, yes, this spoke to them. And, I was fortunate that many people in Paris did share their story with me. So what I learned was, and Margot, you tell me if this is something that you teach in your writing classes or not. One of the basic rules about writing, they say, is write what you know. And so I'm jumping off a cliff without a parachute, writing something I don't know. But what I discovered, David, to answer your question at great length, in the process of writing it, is that I do know this. My parents left the part of India after the British left and it was divided into two countries. They found themselves on the wrong side of the religious divide. So they were suddenly outsiders, foreigners in their own country. And, for me, being an outsider in Paris, well, it's evident. But I wondered what it would feel like to become a stranger in your own country, which is what happened to the French Jews. They were as French as anyone could be. And then all of a sudden, this dividing line was drawn based on religion, and they were no longer considered French. So I learned that even if it's not a place and a time that's your own, or that you feel you know, what lies under it is love and loss and longing. And that's something I do know, and I think all of us know.
We have some great questions. Ruth says, how do you know, let me just make sure I'm doing this, getting this right. How do you know when to end the story?
Would you just check and see if this is Ruth Greenfield?
It is.
Does it say? Ruth, my dear friend, who lives in Miami, who in fact introduced me to Paris, and which I love now, both for its own sake and for hers. She is actually a very dazzling pianist. She studied in Paris with Nadia Boulanger. So Ruth, I'll answer the question about the ending by saying that it's like a piece of music. You know, there are all these things that need to be resolved. Sometimes it's a dissonance, sometimes it's a chord left hanging, but when it is resolved, you know that everything has been leading ineluctably to this moment. So I may not know when I start out what's the beginning. I have a lot of false starts. I may not know as I'm going where I'm going, but when it resolves itself, I know I've reached the end. One note too much would be too much. One note too little would leave you wanting something. So in terms of music, that's something you would understand, that you've hit the end and that's it. And then you hope that the echoes of it linger.
Ren to Go says, I read the book and love the book. And the question is about both Haunting Paris, but also writing in general. To what extent do you control what is being written? And to what extent does the book, oh, I only wish, and to what extent does the book write itself? And you write the channel where the characters develop themselves as you are writing?
Well, that's another very writerly question. You know, we'd all
Yes.
like to feel like we are channeling this voice that comes to us. And for me, it is very much the voice that's the starting place. If I hear the voice, I know that I am just going to latch onto it and go wherever it takes me. It's a weird thing, but I only do descriptions, physical descriptions, in very broad strokes. It's almost like, you know, Japanese calligraphy, one little line here to stand for something, because I think readers can visualize so vividly just with a suggestion here or a suggestion there. But the voice has to be absolutely authentic and unmistakable. You know, all the characters in the book, including Coco the dog, you should know without any he said or Ana Carvalho said or Will the American said, you should know who's saying it just by their tone of voice. So that's what I both listen to and write down, but you know, I don't know that I control it that much. And so much of it comes, the deepest writing comes from your subconscious, from things you are not aware of consciously. But once they're on the page, you realize, yes, that's exactly where this is meant to be going. So control is a strong word for somebody who's, you know, as out of control, I feel, of the manuscript as I am when I start. My control comes very much in the rewriting process. So thank you. That was an interesting question.
Yeah, so a certain amount of channeling and quite a lot of finding the way.
Okay, before we go on to the next one, Margot, since you're a writer, you have a book coming out. Why don't you answer this one too? How much of it is, setting out with a map, and how much of it is, finding your way?
The briefest answer I can give is that having written an unbelievably bad novel in my 20s, I decided I wouldn't write a novel. I decided first I would never write a novel again. And then when I changed that decision, I decided that I had to know the ending, even if I didn't know how I was going to get there. So I have a destination, although not a precise route. But I want to just make sure we get to there are a couple of other lovely questions I want to make sure we get to. For Benjamin asks, this is a question for both of you. Do you have any advice for writing convincingly and specifically from and about a setting, especially for a place like Paris that so many people already have strong associations with and assumptions about? How can you make it Chaudhry's Paris rather than Henry Miller's Paris?
Well, I can tell you very clearly it's very different from Henry Miller's Paris or Joyce's Paris or Beckett's Paris. But I think I'm just going to answer this briefly because I'm also interested in what Margot has to say. Since she has a body of work, and my entire body of work is one very slim book. So I can just tell you about Paris, that to me, in the writing of this, Paris became not just setting, but also a character. And I think that some of the scenes that take place could only have taken place there. There are some things that, between, for instance, there's this relationship between Sylvie, who's acting as a stepmother, and the stepchildren. I mean, that could be set anywhere. But there are other things that are so specific to Paris. So, Benjamin, I think my response to you is to make the city just so palpable as it is to you, whatever the city is, whether it's London, whether it's, Coral Gables, whatever the city is, to make it so palpable that someone can feel they are there. And that's all you need, is to make that setting come alive for the characters, for the reader, and for yourself. But Margot, you answer this.
No, I just think it's a fascinating question. And one of the things I think one can do as a writer is to take little known settings that are maybe in the margins, and move them closer to the center. But there's also a certain exhilaration in going to storied cities, storied places, and making them your own storied place. So taking a place where, as Benjamin says, many people have assumptions, and yet making it the city or place that belongs to your characters. And I think that just means what you say, both that the place becomes a character, but that the attitude your characters have to it, the relationship they have to it, governs how it appears on the pages, how you summon it, as it were.
And so about your new book that's coming out, it says The Boy in the Field. Can you tell us where that field is? Just for the place.
But then we have to go to the next wonderful question. The field is in the countryside outside Oxford, in England, not America.
Well, another storied place that you're dealing with.
Yeah. Sarah asks, your language is so beautiful, so poetic and musical. Were you reading poetry when writing, and do you have favorite poets whom you return to as you're reading and writing?
Oh, that's a lovely question. You know, I think it's music more than poetry that influences my language. Um, I don't know if Margot knows this, but some of you, Ruth knows this, and some people who are listening from Miami know this, that I used to be an announcer and a program director for a classical music radio station, you know, so hey, I was a DJ, but because it's classical music, we say announcer. Um, so I was very influenced by music, and if I had a lick of talent, I would have wanted to be, you know, a concert pianist like Ruth Greenfield, but I don't, and I have massacred a couple of instruments in my attempts. But I do have an instrument, and that is language. So, Sarah, I think that what you're saying about the poetic thing, it's very much rhythm and cadence and tone and tempo, which of course poetry just distills to an essence. Um, and I feel like these countervailing tugs when I'm writing, you know, as Margot so graciously said about you want to turn the pages. So that's the accelerando, let's get it moving faster. And then there is also the holding back, like holding it, slowing it down, because it's that retardando in music, you know, go slower, that you linger on a phrase or on an image that allows you to slow down in the language. And I think, you know, the writing is going well when the language just flows, and when it's awkward and spiky, you know, you haven't got to what you're trying to get to.
And I should say that the asker of that question, Sarah Stone, is herself a wonderful novelist who writes extremely musical and lovely prose.
Hello, Sarah Stone. I didn't see the last name on here, but I think I follow you on Twitter, so I know all about you. You know, with the social media platform. So thank you for coming and for asking a question that is so much the center of why I write, which is for the language.
And the next question is also from a wonderful writer, Ron Nyron, who has a novel coming out, I believe, in this November, or anyway, I hope it's soon. Ron asks, how did you manage orchestrating different points of view and different time periods? And what helped you to find the right pattern? Right patterns? What and who did you have to pare away?
Oh, Ron, listen, there's fully a third of the book that was excised from the final version, okay? It was, I had, if you think I've complicated my life with the time periods I'm dealing with, I had a whole section about Paris under Roman occupation, you know, the Nazi occupation, Roman occupation, and it just had to be totally cut out. But nothing is wasted. You know, I really believe that. In his book with Walter Murch, Michael Ondaatje and Walter Murch, The Conversations, they're talking about editing, and they're talking about films, but it works also for writing, that what you cut out, if it is well excised, still leaves a trace of what there was before. And it's like the city of Paris is in all these layers. So below the surface layer, there are all these archaeological layers that exist that you may not necessarily see. And let me get to your question, which I wander off from, as is my wont all the time. But to get to the time periods, you know, I had to anchor it to something. So it was 1989, which has actually a direct bearing on the year 1942. When you read the book, you will see that the celebration of the bicentennial ties into that date very strongly. So those were the two. And then Julien, of course, has access to other time periods where he can see that this history of anti-Semitism did not begin with the Nazis. It has a very long history in France. So those were some of the, you know, I could have written about other scenes in history, but I picked and chose the ones that had direct relevance to what I was writing about. And so I want to know the name of your book. Can you just type it into the chat or the questions? Or maybe Margot can tell me. Or you can get in touch with me later through my website. And
my keyboard is actually out of reach, so I don't think
okay. Okay. So, hey, you can all ask questions you might have not thought of at the moment. Reach me through my website and we can chat.
Ron Nyron has kindly typed the title of his book. It's the Book of Lost Light.
Oh, how lovely. So
Beautiful
Sharon Stone,
Sarah Stone.
Ron's, sorry?
Sarah Stone, not Sharon.
Sarah. Oh, why did I say that? You see, I'm making all sorts of, I told you I should have had wine. I'm much more coherent with it. Sarah Stone, Ron's book, the Book of Lost Light, and Margot. So, you know, I'm urging you to buy books from Harvard Bookstore. They don't all have to be mine. It would be nice if some were, but you've got a variety of writers to choose from.
And maybe we have time for just two questions if we're focused.
Okay.
Yeah, that sounds good to me.
Lauren, I have to stay. Okay, I'm going to stay on point here.
Krishna Lewis very sweetly asks, who are your favorite contemporary authors aside from Margot?
Well, Krishna, can I say that I have a lot of very dear to me authors, but I also have a lot of very dear to me writer friends. And this is the kind of question I cannot answer because I will surely leave somebody out, and I don't want to do that at all. But I will tell you that a book that I just read recently that I enjoyed very much, because it's a book about books and libraries, and it's called The Library Book by Susan Orlean, whom I don't know at all. So I'm perfectly happy doing this. I have both on my to read pile and have read pile a stack of names. I tell you what, I will tell you that if you email me, I will tell you some of my favorites, but you know, I don't want to leave out someone whom I would be very sorry to leave out. So, okay, on to the next.
Andrea Cole asks a question that I think is quite complicated to answer. So I'm going to suggest maybe afterwards you could type your answer to Andrea and just move on to Tony Epral's question. Do you miss your characters now that the book is making its own way in the world? And do you have any plans to revisit their lives?
Oh, good heavens, no. I do miss them. I miss hearing their voices. I miss hearing the music in the book. You know, there is a sort of a soundtrack to the book because it's all so tied into music. But, you know, somebody says, oh, why don't you write another book related to this? And I think I would sooner gouge my eyes out than do that. They have said goodbye to me. They're not knocking on my door. You know, like we were talking about when Ruth asked the question, how do you know you've reached the end? I know this is the end for this, but I hope not for writing. I hope this doesn't turn out to be the one and only. And then the second book is always very dismaying to tackle. And Andrea Cole, I'm sorry we didn't get to your question, but it sounds like if it's complicated, that it's lovely. So I hope I'll get a chance to answer it.
Mamta, that was just wonderful and so eloquent and so informative. And I will be thinking about some of your answers about writing in the weeks and months to come. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Margot. Thanks to Lauren. Thanks to Harvard Bookstore. Thanks to all of you for joining us tonight.
I just want to thank you both, Mamta and Margot, for this fantastic conversation. It was such a pleasure to be here for it. Thank you for all of you out there spending your evening with us. Please learn more about this remarkable book and purchase Haunting Paris at the link in the chat. And on behalf of Harvard Bookstore here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, have a good night, keep reading, and stay safe. Thank you guys. Have a great night.